When the sick little wolf cubs surrounded the man who had raised them, he noticed something different in their approach. It was as if they were trying to tell him something. He followed them to see what was wrong, and what happened next was unbelievable. Just as the sun was beginning to set, Milo started packing his fishing gear. His catch for the day had been plentiful, and the old man felt content. The sound of the birds and his equipment clanking as he put them in the bag was the only noise that could be heard in the forest. But then a rustling in the bushes ahead made him pause. He scanned around, but he didn't see anything. Then, when he wasn't looking, sick little wolf cubs emerged from the undergrowth at his side, their tiny forms framed by the fading light. They moved cautiously at first, their noses twitching as they picked up his scent. Then, in a move that made his heart skip a beat, they began to circle him, their bright eyes locked onto his. Milo's breath caught in his throat, not because he was afraid of them, but because their approach wasn't like anything they had done before. A normal person would have shrieked in surprise or fear, but he was calm. The wolf cubs sat on the ground and looked at him. It wasn't their first meeting. Over the years spent in nature, his favorite place, Milo had become attuned to the rhythms of the wild, learning to read the signs and signals that most others would miss. He knew the calls of the birds, the tracks of the deer, and the habits of the fish that swam in the river near his cabin. One day, as he had gone fishing in the woods, he found signs that made him aware of a wolf pack deep in the forest. He had enough sense to get out of there, but something made him stop in his tracks. His heart skipped a beat as he heard the sound of whimpering. He approached the den gingerly, trying not to scare off whatever was inside. Inside, he couldn't believe his eyes. He found 6 tiny wolf cubs, their eyes barely open, huddled together for warmth. They looked to be days old. He looked around, but there was no sign of the mother, and the cubs looked weak and hungry. Against his better judgment, Milo decided to stay with them. He knew the risks. Wolves were protective of their young, and if the mother returned, she would not take kindly to his presence. But something in him couldn't let him leave them there without knowing their fate. He had a feeling they had been there for quite a long time, which was unlikely for a mother wolf. Milo spent the next hour at the entrance of the cave, waiting to see if the mother wolf would come. He stayed in a safe place where she wouldn't see him, although he was less confident about her ability to smell him, especially with his fishing gear and the catch of the day. But his worries were moot. When the evening sun set, the mother wolf was still nowhere to be found. Feeling some sympathy for the little wolves, he went home, promising himself to return the next day. The pups were too young to eat his fish, so he couldn't leave them any. He just made sure to light a small fire to keep them warm. He didn't know why, but he felt responsible for them. Milo spent the next few days returning to the den, bringing milk and water in feeding bottles for the cubs. He knew the milk he bought might not be the best for them, but at least it kept them full. He was troubled by why the mother wolf had abandoned her cubs, but there was nothing he could do about it. Then one morning, on his way to the den, while using another route, he stumbled upon a wolf corpse. As he examined it, the heartbreaking realization struck him. It could be the mother wolf. The thought of her venturing out to find food to nourish herself so she could feed her babies, only to meet a tragic end, brought him to tears. It was a sad fate. Nature could be cruel. He had seen it countless times. For the little wolf cubs, it meant the end of the road. They were all alone without their mother. Nature wouldn't be kind to them. But Milo didn't have it in him to let nature run its course. He had the opportunity to help the cubs, and he realized he could not turn his back on them now. This gave him a fulfilling mission, and he found himself going to the den every day. He kept his distance, not wanting to interfere too much, but the cubs quickly grew accustomed to his presence. As they grew stronger, they began to venture out of the den, their playful antics bringing a rare smile to Milo's face. During this time, Milo developed a bond with the cubs. He named them Luna, Grey, Anil, Shadow, Moon, and Ralph, after their distinctive fur patterns. Luna, Grey, and Anil had light, almost silver coats, while Shadow, Moon, and Ralph had darker, more mysterious appearances. The bond between Milo and the cubs deepened over the weeks. They would often follow him on his fishing trips, their playful barks and howls echoing through the forest. But their relationship wasn't without its challenges. There were times when the wild instincts of the cubs clashed with Milo's human nature. Luna, in particular, had a mischievous streak and often tested Milo's patience. Shadow, Grey, and Ralph, on the other hand, were more reserved, always watching and learning from a distance. As for Anil and Moon, they always got themselves into trouble. Their relationship was tested in ways Milo could never have imagined. Once, during a particularly harsh winter, Milo was caught in a blizzard while fishing. The biting cold and swirling snow disoriented him, and he quickly lost his way. As night began to fall, Milo realized he was in big trouble. He had no place to sleep, and he was rapidly running out of energy. Just as he was about to give up hope, he heard a familiar sound, the sound of his little wolf cubs howling. They were calling for him, wondering where he was. With Milo calling back to them, they somehow managed to find him in the storm and led him back to the safety of his cabin. Another time, it was Milo who saved the cubs. A group of hunters was in the forest, and the cubs' lives were threatened. He knew the cubs were too young to defend themselves, so he took matters into his own hands. He went out of his way to divert the hunters, leading them on a wild goose chase through the woods. It was a risky move, but it paid off. Eventually, the poachers gave up, and the cubs were safe. Now, as the cubs surrounded him in the forest, Milo knew that something was wrong. Over time, their bond had grown stronger, and he could tell all their worries and expressions. He was like a father, and fathers knew their kids well enough to understand what couldn't be said in words. What was about to happen next was unbelievable. The cubs stared up at Milo, their eyes gleaming like the stars beginning to appear in the darkening sky. There was something different about their demeanor, a sense of urgency that Milo hadn't seen before. Luna, the more spirited of the two, stepped closer, her nose brushing against Milo's hand as if trying to communicate something. Shadow followed suit, his gaze intense as if he too had something to convey. He jumped onto Milo's lap, something he had never done before. Milo kneeled down to their level, his heart pounding in his chest. What was wrong with the cubs? He had learned to read their body language over the months they had spent together, but this was new. The cubs were usually playful, but now they were almost serious. As he looked into their eyes, it was as if they were trying to tell him something important. He could feel a sense of urgency in the air, a tension that made the hairs on the back of his neck stand on end. And then he noticed it. One wolf cub was missing. He looked around, and sure enough, he couldn't see Moon anywhere. Suddenly, Shadow stepped down from Milo's lap and let out a soft whine. He then darted toward the trees, glancing back at Milo as if urging him to follow. The other wolf cubs followed him into the forest. Shadow stayed behind, still urging Milo to follow them. He stayed by Milo's side, his body tense and alert. Without hesitation, Milo stood up and began to follow the wolf cubs. Whatever it was that had the cubs so worked up, he needed to find out. As he moved deeper into the forest, the sounds of the night grew louder. The chirping of crickets, the rustling of leaves as they walked, and the distant call of an owl filled the air. But underneath it all, Milo could hear something else. A low, steady rumble that seemed to be getting louder with each step. He could feel that Moon was in trouble. He quickened his pace, the cubs right on his heels, led by Shadow, until they reached a small clearing where Shadow stopped. In the center of the clearing, bathed in the haunting glow of the moonlight, was a huge uprooted tree, its roots stretching out like the arms of a giant. The trunk had fallen into a narrow ditch, and its branches formed a temporary bridge on a steep slope below. But it wasn't the tree that had the cubs so worked up. It was the sound coming from below it. Their sister, Moon, had been trapped. At first, Milo couldn't quite figure it out. The roar of the river below punctuated the sharp, high-pitched whimpers of the little cub. But when he leaned closer to the fallen tree and peered into the darkness below, what he saw made his heart stop. Trapped in the tangle of roots and branches was Moon, looking weak and about to give up. Her siblings made sounds as if to comfort her. Her fur was matted with mud, and she was struggling to free herself, letting out pitiful cries of distress. It seemed that she had likely tried to cross the tree bridge and had slipped, becoming entangled in the roots. She was in a precarious position, and if she fell, there was no way she would survive the drop into the ravine below. Milo's mind raced. He had to act quickly. The cub was in serious danger, and there was no time to waste. He turned to her siblings, who were both pacing anxiously at the edge of the ravine, their eyes never leaving the trapped cub. He thought of a way to get the wolf cub out. He knew he had to be careful. One wrong move could cause the cub to fall, and that was something he didn't want. After some thinking, Milo lay down on the tree trunk, carefully inching his way across the narrow bridge. The tree creaked and groaned under his weight, but he pushed forward, determined to reach the cub. The other cubs watched Milo anxiously, hoping that he would succeed in saving their sibling. His heart pounded in his chest, each breath a reminder of how dangerous the rescue was. As he got closer, he could see the cub's eyes, wide with fear, her little body trembling. She was so close, but still just out of reach. Milo stretched out his hand, his fingers brushing against the cub's fur. The little wolf whimpered, her cries growing louder. Gritting his teeth, Milo leaned further, grabbing hold of the cub's scruff and slowly, carefully, pulling her free from the roots. The tree groaned under the added weight, and for a moment, Milo feared they would both tumble into the ravine. But then, with a final tug, the cub was free. Milo cradled the cub against his chest as he began to inch his way back across the tree trunk. The ground felt impossibly far away, and the darkness below seemed to stretch on forever. But finally, after what felt like an eternity, he reached the edge of the ravine and carefully handed the cub over to the other wolf cubs. Luna and Anil immediately began to nuzzle and lick their sibling, their relief palpable. As Milo sat back, catching his breath, he couldn't help but smile. He had finally managed to rescue the little wolf cub. He watched as the 6 cubs reunited, their tails wagging furiously. Luna couldn't stop licking Moon, who was still trembling from her ordeal. Moon clung to her siblings as if drawing strength from their presence. Milo felt a deep sense of connection to the little wolves. They were no longer just wolves he had stumbled upon in a den. They were part of his life, and he was part of theirs. Milo got up and started walking toward his cabin. Now that he had succeeded in saving the cub, it was time to go home. He led the way, with the cubs following behind, wagging their tails cheerfully. They knew they had a protector in him. As the moon rose higher in the sky, casting a silvery light over the forest, something extraordinary began to happen. The little cubs huddled together and started to howl softly. Their voices, though young and untrained, harmonized in a way that sent shivers down Milo's spine. It was a sound of pure emotion, like a song of gratitude and joy that filled the night air. Milo had heard wolves howl before, but this was different. It was their first howl, yet it felt as if they were singing directly to him, acknowledging the bond they shared. Milo was proud. The bond between him and the cubs had been strong before, but now it was unbreakable. Though it was odd, he felt they were family, and he wouldn't wish to have it any other way. They had saved each other's lives in ways that no one would have ever believed.